sake of paper. Okay. I will read the first part, and then we will move on to Joshua 24:14 to 26. Our reading today is from the last chapter of Joshua. The first part of the chapter is Joshua gathering all the tribes of Israel and sharing from God a retelling of what God has done in their lives and the lives of their ancestors. The retelling of the story goes all the way back before Abraham, then getting liberated from Egypt, wandering in the wilderness, and how God was with them and brought them to the land they are in now. We pick up at verse 14 to hear the people's response to Joshua. Joshua then said, I now call upon you to revere and serve Yahweh completely and sincerely. Cast off the gods that your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt, and worship Yahweh alone. If you do not want to worship Yahweh, then make the decision today whom you will worship, even if it is the gods of your ancestors beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose country you live. As for me and my household, we will worship Yahweh. Then the people responded, Far be it from us to abandon Yahweh to worship other gods. It was Yahweh our God who brought us and our ancestors up and out of the land of slavery. Yahweh performed great signs before our eyes. Yahweh protected us on the entire journey and among all the peoples whose lands we passed through. Yahweh drove them out before us, the Amorites and all the people dwelling in the land. We too will serve Yahweh, who is our God. Joshua said to the people, You will not be able to serve Yahweh. This is a God, most holy, a jealous God. A God who does not forgive your transgressions and your sins. If done for you, you will bring disasters, fatal ones upon yourselves. But the people protested, No, we will serve Yahweh. Then Joshua said, You are your own witnesses that you are choosing to serve Yahweh. Yes, we are witnesses, they replied. Now then, said Joshua, throw away the alien gods among you and turn your hearts to Yahweh, the God of Israel. Then the assembly said to Joshua, We will serve and obey Yahweh our God. On that day, Joshua ratified the covenant with the people, drew up the statutes and the ordinances for them at Shechem, where they were recorded in the book of God's laws. Then Joshua took a large stone and set it up there under an oak tree close by the sanctuary of Yahweh.
Thank you, John, for reading that scripture for us. As I heard that scripture this week, I kept wondering about stories. Do you have a family story that gets told and retold? Maybe it's the story of how your grandparents met, or the story of how your family ended up in the land where they were living. We each have stories that shape us and that we pass on to the next generation. And often these stories change a bit as they get told and passed down by different people, generation by generation, kind of like a long game of telephone through the generations. And when we tell these stories in our generations, we are connecting ourselves back to that original story, reconnecting ourselves to our family roots or our community groundings. And that's what we heard a bit of in the verses from Joshua. They are retelling, reclaiming the stories of their ancestors. In the part that we didn't read of that chapter, Joshua goes all the way back before Abraham to talk about the story of their people, telling the story of how God has been with them through the generations. And now their leader Joshua is about to die, and he's making sure that his people know their story. He's reminding them that they get to choose to follow Yahweh, which is something I really appreciate about these verses, that getting to choose. Joshua is saying, you have a choice. You can follow other gods, but you just need to choose and commit. We all dedicate our lives to something, so what will that something be? to which the people insistently respond, "We choose to serve Yahweh." So all of this then raises questions for us. What stories do we tell? What stories get told in our community? How do we choose to tell the stories we tell? And what stories maybe aren't getting told? And how are we inhabiting these stories that are passed down generation by generation, making them our own as we look towards the future to come? It's the work of each generation to make the faith their own and to pass it along, to notice and ask what stories we tell and how that shapes our faith and our communities. What is our grounding and our center? This year, I have found myself wondering how to answer the questions, why do we do this thing called church? What difference does it make in the world? And as Betty Priest said a couple weeks ago, maybe now, more than ever in our world, the church needs to be the church. But to do that, we have to remember who we are and what it means to be the church, what stories we have that ground us, and why we gather. And this storytelling and recommitting to serving God that we hear in Joshua fits well with our annual covenanting service today. This is our once-a-year opportunity to pause in our typical rhythms and to say yes to this faith community. Whether it's a full, joyful yes, or maybe a more tentative, quiet yes. Each one of you here is a part of our story as a people of faith seeking to follow Jesus in this time and this place in the world. And just as Joshua said, we get to choose to serve Yahweh, to serve Jesus. We get to choose where we spend our time, our energy, and our care in this world. And so as we move towards our time of covenanting together this morning, we get to ponder together what stories make up our faith and our community. And we get to do that by hearing from people in our community of how their story intersects with the story of this church. And so I've asked a few people to share with us from the early days all the way up until now. And so we'll hear from Roger and then Deb and Teresa. So I invite you to listen to this storytelling. Roger.
Good morning. Inspirational speaker Wally Pond once said, "Some of my best memories never really happened." Hopefully, most of my story will be accurate and not too distorted by the years. The first time I entered this building in August of 1975, at the age of 19, there was a suspended ceiling of embroidered feed bags hanging down to just above the lights on the light chains. Over there was an unused soda machine, and there was a ping pong and a pool table. This was not Hyde Park Mennonite Fellowship, but instead the Hyde Park Friendship House, a place where neighborhood kids could hang out after school. I was one of 8 VSers, volunteers with Mennonite Voluntary Service, who lived together in the VS house on the southwest corner of this block. The vision for the VS unit and later the church started with the imagination of Archie Jansen, a Mennonite from Nampa, who was a teacher at Longfellow Elementary. I can imagine Archie looking out his school window after a busy day, thinking about how there could be more of a Mennonite presence in Boise. On his drive home one day, he noticed that this building was for sale by the Quakers who owned it at the time. I can imagine his curiosity, hope, and feeling of possibility. Archie's excitement was shared by the leadership of Nampa Mennonite Church, and they proceeded to buy the building and to invite a voluntary service unit to be established in Boise with the goal of doing community work and eventually planting a church. In addition to running the Friendship House, the unit provided service through working as teachers' aides, assistance at Elks Rehabilitation Hospital, and working at the YMCA. There was even a VS rock band that hosted regular coffee houses right here in this room. Not without some controversy, Frank and Vanjie King conducted draft counseling here as well. In fact, the draft had a role to play in why I came all the way out to Idaho from Pennsylvania. The last draft call-up for the Vietnam War was in December of 1972, but in my idealist young head, just because there was no longer a draft didn't mean I should not do some alternative service at some point. I felt the call to join VS in the spring of my sophomore year at Goshen College. It was a year of growth for me, learning to live together with 7 other people in the unit house was not always easy. Tim Yoder was also in the unit when I was, but he was always easy to get along with. Existing on a $15 a month stipend was challenging. I shouldn't complain though, we did get a raise up to $25 partway through the year. It was hard being far from home, part of which was a long distance relationship with Pam, who I had only met and grown close to a couple of months before. But I fell in love with Boise and with Idaho and with the idea of being part of a Mennonite community striving to be the body of Christ here in the wonderful West. The pastor of Nampa Mennonite, whose day job was farming, Robert Garber, and his wife Ann became our mentors in connection with the Nampa church. 2 Sundays a month they would come here and we would have a very small church service. And the other 2 Sundays we would travel over to Nampa for services there. Sometimes it seemed to me that we were not making very much progress as far as getting a new church started, but I do think we were pretty well known for the service that we were providing in the local community. When my 1-year term was up, I returned to Goshen, and after 2 more years of study, Pam and I got married, spent a year in Pennsylvania, but then returned to Boise. By this time, Larry and Rebecca Howder had accepted the call to be HPMF's first pastor. Other new people had arrived on the scene like Leonard and Karen Nolt, who were living in intentional community with the Howders in a house on 16th Street. And the first covenant was hanging on the wall. And here it is. And you can see the signatures of the people that signed it. The group was small, but vibrant, and a slow trickle of people helped their fellowship grow. As with the VS years, we were very centered on service, a calling that survives until this day. It is with joy and gratitude that I renew my covenant with this body today. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. That was really interesting. It's fun to hear some of those details. We've picked up a few in the years we've been here, but it's fun to hear the whole story. As I started thinking back about my journey and how we ended up here, I realized my life has been intertwined with Mennonites probably since I was 2, but it's been within the last 5-6 years, maybe more. I can't remember when we came here that we actually attended a Mennonite church. So I don't have as much about since we've been here, but kind of the whole lead up to how we ended up here. My parents are missionaries, and I was born into a conservative Christian family. My parents had been in Morocco. I have 3 older brothers. One was born in Oregon, the next one in Switzerland while they were learning French, and the next one in Morocco while they were learning Arabic. They had come back for my dad to finish up his missionary medical certificate down at Biola, and he was down there, and my mom and my brothers were up in Oregon when I was born. In Lebanon, Oregon, where their sending church was a conservative Baptist church, and now I understand there's a Mennonite church in Lebanon, which I don't know how long it's existed, but not where we attended when we were there. However, when my parents went out to Morocco, they were sent and went out with Gospel Missionary Union, which is in Missouri, and there were a lot of Mennonites that went out with them. In fact, one of the couples that they went through candidate school with and traveled to Morocco with were the Yoders, and they were still the very simple dressing. They didn't do zippers, they did buttons, and so that was my parents' first association with Mennonites. When we lived in Morocco, one of the places we lived was called Sunset Farm. We called it Sunset Farm. It was a conference ground for Moroccans. And Roger, speaking about voluntary service, we had the PAX boys who were the conscientious objectors. And I was pretty small, but I still remember those two, Wayne and Larry, and what a big impact they made when they were there helping construct the facility and just their input. In fact, the first night they were there, one apparently wasn't a very smart kid. One was Wayne King, and he said, "How is my grandmother a king?" And it just baffled me. I couldn't quite figure it out. Okay, I was like 4, so you gotta give me that. We came back to the States when the Moroccan government started kicking out missionaries. They were over missionaries being there and started asking them to leave. And my parents wanted to be able to return. So we packed up quickly. My mom packed up quickly within about 2 weeks, and we came back to the States and landed in Salem, where we lived for 5 years. At that point, we also went to a very conservative community church, but still had interaction with Mennonites. Later on, right before my sophomore, or if you're Canadian, 10th grade year, they asked my parents to go to Germany, to Black Forest Academy, to be the dorm parents there in a girls' dorm, which was run by their mission, Gospel Missionary Union, and they agreed. Well, they asked me, they said, they want us to go to Africa or Germany, where do you want to go? And I said, I'll go to Germany. So we went to Germany. At Black Forest Academy was a Mennonite school started by Canadian Mennonite brothers who had a singing ministry, evangelical ministry. And so we had more, in Morocco we had lots of Yoders and Friesens and Giesbrecks, and in Germany there were even more, lots of Mennonites. So I ended up graduating from Black Forest Academy, came back, went down to Biola, where I ended up meeting Jim. Jim and I, as we were dating and married still, went to conservative Christian churches, and pretty much the same thing we had both grown up on. When we decided to move up here, we did the same thing, a few different conservative churches in the area, and we were of the mind that once you get into a church, you're committed, you stay there. But various and sundry things happened at a couple of the churches, and we ended up leaving. And it was a hard move, leaving some of those, even though we knew we couldn't stay. The last church we attended was a little more progressive, and there were ideas that I was like, why have I never heard this? In fact, some of the things, it baffled me, and it kind of made me angry. Why was I never taught this? It was probably more like, why didn't I seek it out? But I was still in that mindset. So when that church fell apart, we were done. We're just like, no, we are not going back to what we've been in. We just can't. So we were just done with church. Well, I was working at a job just down on Eastman and 12th, and we'd get out and walk. And one day I walked by and I saw the banners for, I think there was a quilt show. And I thought, oh, it's a Mennonite church. I didn't know there was a Mennonite church here. So that just kind of was in the back of my mind, but not really, going anywhere. Jim and I weren't attending, which always made me feel guilty because we'd been in church. If it was Sunday, we were in church. And he just said no, and I said, well, how about we try this? And he said, I don't know. So I listened to a couple of Mark's sermons, and I said, why don't you listen and see what you think? He did. I said, yeah, okay, let's go visit. So we worked up our courage and dedication and came one Sunday morning. We sat in the very back, so we could just kind of sit back there and not be noticed too much. When the singing started, I just felt this peace flow over me. The churches we had been going to, I was kind of over the music. It was more like a production and a loud concert, and it just was not. I had grown up on hymns and just wasn't quite speaking to me. Jim felt like he was at camp, which had always been a great thing during the singing. So we were really positive about that. Then Mark got up to speak, and he spoke for about 15 minutes, and it was a very simple sermon. I was used to the long expository sermons in the churches we had gone to, and I thought, wow, that was really simple. But during the week, his words kept coming back to me and hitting me in different ways and speaking to me, which normally didn't happen with some of those longer expository sermons. And here we are. It has been such a pleasure to be here. The things I've learned, new ideas, we were just starting on that a little more progressive journey before it. New ideas that have come up. And some of I've been surprised at. I remember when Pam Piper Ruth said, God our Mother, and my jaw probably dropped because I had never heard that before. Oh, let me look into this, the divine feminine, the working in the community, serving, not just trying to get people saved. So we are grateful for finding this church, for being a part of it, and I can't say, that's one of the nice things, I can't say if it's a Sunday we're in the seats, because here people don't ask you, where were you last week if you're not there? But we're still here.
Well, I can't quite get the numbers right, but so the question I was asked is, why did I come and why did I stay? So I first came 40 years ago. I believe I was 26, and I came because I was invited. I'd never heard of Mennonites, knew nothing about Mennonites. It was a kind of a painful time in my life. I was going through a divorce, and my husband and I were part of a very fundamentalist Christian church, and I felt a lot of sort of external judgment about my decision to end the relationship. We'd been together since I was 15, and so 11 years. So when I left that relationship and the church I'd been involved with, and was feeling a lot of judgment from outside and internal judgment, I sort of wondered whether I would be welcome in a Christian church. And when I came here, I felt this is a long time ago, I can't even believe it. I felt a lot of grace. I felt welcomed. I felt like it was okay for me to participate. And I jumped into a small group. I later learned that I hadn't been specifically invited, but I just showed up. and that was cool. And I started participating in the activities of the church. And I think I just developed a sense of belonging. I felt there was this softness here that meant something to me. So I did not expect this, sorry. So I was here for, I don't know how long I was here, 15 or 20 years. My current husband, he got married, and he was a really good sport. He showed up at, quote, my church, and he was raised Catholic, and he was used to more of a high church model, and this was very different for him. But he was a good sport and came with me, but there was a point where he wanted to explore something else. And I've got kind of a gypsy heart. I love to learn. I love to explore special spiritual practices. So I said, well, pick something. I'll go with you. And so he chose the Episcopal Church. So we went there for a while, and we got involved in a small group that did a deep dive on the spiritual journey, mostly following Father Thomas Keating, a Trappist monk, and kind of Christian meditation, centering prayer, Lectio Divino, various contemplative practices. So we got very involved there for several years, and that was very rich and meaningful for us to do together. And then the group sort of disbanded when the leaders moved out of the area. So we kind of dropped off and stopped going. And he wasn't particularly drawn to go anywhere else, and so it's like, what's my next step? My mother was getting feeble, and I thought, well, I could start taking her to her church so she didn't have to drive. So I took her to her church for several years, and it was more of a metaphysical church. Again, gypsy heart, love learning, all sorts of spiritual practices. So I went with her for several years until she died, and tried staying there for a little while afterward, but it wasn't quite as good a fit, and I realized, gee, I have a choice. Art, was willing to kind of be on the edge and participate wherever I wanted to go, but not really centrally, and was supportive of whatever I decided. My mom died, so I asked myself, where did I want to go? I said, I'm going home. So I came back here. And so I went through Larry, and I went through Tim, and I went through Linda, and then left somewhere in Linda, but I never really left, because even when I was gone at the Episcopal Church, I continued to meet in a small group with Linda and Paula's mom, Anna Zook, for several years. So I was still connected to the church, and sometimes with Larry and Becky. We did Lectio in the evening. So I kind of maintained my connections with the church even when I was gone. And so I've come back, I think it was right before the pandemic, and I had just barely met Mark for a few months, and then the pandemic hit. And so and Gary was here, and now Christie. And so I'm here because I feel at home. I feel, I appreciate sort of the nuance here. When I first came, everything was literal and everything was black and white, and here there was a little bit more room for interpretation, grace, nuance. I called it sort of the gray zone, which was how I felt back then, but I didn't quite feel like I fit because I didn't see everything in black and white terms. And here allowed more room for conversation and interpretation, and I appreciate that warmth. And so I feel at home here. That's why I'm here.
Well, appreciate these stories. It's so good to hear. As a response to that, let's turn to 588 in the hymn book.